He walked in just as the rain stopped. I was standing in the kitchen, drying my hands on a towel, when I heard the front door open and that familiar rustle of someone shaking water off their jacket. I thought it was my husband, home earlier than usual. But then I heard the voice, deeper, younger, not heard in this house for years, and I turned, towel still in hand. He looked different. Broader shoulders, darker stubble, the quiet confidence of someone who had spent enough time away to become his own person. There was something else, too. Not just maturity, but a softness in his eyes when he looked at me, like he remembered who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's hostess, someone's background. He hugged my husband first, a firm grip, laughter in his voice. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 3 years. I stayed back, arms crossed over my apron, unsure how to greet him. But when he turned to me, his smile didn't waver. He stepped forward and hugged me too. Not out of obligation, but as if he truly wanted to. "You haven't changed at all," he said, his cheek briefly brushing mine. And even though I knew it wasn't true, time is a way of carving itself into your reflection. I felt something flutter just under my ribs. Dinner was uneventful. My husband asked about his work, his travels. I listened, served, refilled glasses, responded when asked. But I watched him, how he leaned back in his chair, arms relaxed, eyes flicking toward me not like a child to a grandmother, but like a man noticing a woman. Once, I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye as I bent to place a dish on the table. Our eyes met for a second. He didn't look away. That night, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I reached into the back of my drawer and pulled out a set I hadn't worn in years. Deep green lace, delicate, impractical, beautiful. I held it against my body just for a moment and then tucked it back in, ashamed of my own hands. He was staying in the guest room. It shared a wall with ours. As I lay in bed beside my husband, who had already drifted off, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of footsteps. He was still awake. Maybe unpacking, maybe pacing. I pictured his fingers brushing the edges of photographs, shirts, a toothbrush. I imagined the veins on his arms, the shape of his collarbone under a white t-shirt, and I hated myself for it. The next morning, I dressed slower than usual. I chose a sleeveless dress, one I hadn't worn in years, and applied perfume that had sat untouched since before the pandemic. At breakfast, my husband barely noticed. He drank his coffee and read headlines on his phone. But when he came down, his hair slightly damp from a shower, a towel slung over his shoulder. He paused. His eyes swept over me and held there for a moment too long. And that was all it took. A moment. "Morning," he said, low and even. "Sleep well?" I asked, keeping my tone even, neutral. He smiled. "Hard not to in a house that smells like fresh coffee and whatever that is you're wearing." And I felt it, heat rising to my cheeks, an involuntary tug at the corner of my mouth. My husband didn't look up from his screen. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of casual conversation, errands, and a grocery list I scribbled out with more care than necessary. I stayed busy, hands moving, feet shifting, but I couldn't quiet the hum beneath my skin. I kept replaying his glance, the weight of it, the way it made me feel. Not young, not desired exactly, but seen. And I realized how starved I had been for that. In the afternoon, I walked past the open door to the guest room and caught a glimpse of him sketching something in a notebook, head bowed, eyes focused. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did, but he didn't let on. There was something sacred in that quiet moment. I stood there, hidden, watching the rhythm of his pencil, the slight twitch of his mouth as he erased a line and redrew it. That night, after dinner, my husband excused himself to watch something on TV. I sat at the dining table, swirling the last of my wine, and he walked in again, barefoot, a book in hand. "Too quiet for you?" he asked, tilting his head. "Sometimes quiet is necessary," I replied, and we exchanged the kind of look that hovers just on the edge of something unnamed. He nodded, then set the book down and poured himself a small glass of wine. Not too close, not too far, just enough to feel like we were sharing space. Later in bed, I lay awake again, this time not ashamed, but unsettled. There was a current now, something real, something rising. And the scariest part wasn't the idea of doing something wrong. It was how good it felt to imagine doing it. How natural. How inevitable. And as I listened to the wind brushing against the window, I knew that I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about his eyes the next morning. Or the next. Or the next. The hardest part wasn't what might happen. It was knowing that something already had. It wasn't planned. That's the first thing I told myself the moment it happened. That it wasn't orchestrated, not something I anticipated, not something I dressed for that morning. Though, if I were honest, I had been thinking more carefully about what I wore each day since he arrived. Nothing too revealing, nothing obvious, but always something that hugged the waist a little more, bared just a touch of skin near the shoulders, hinted at a form I hadn't realized I still wanted to show. It had been 4 days since his return, 4 quiet dinners, 4 mornings of exchanging short glances over coffee, 4 nights of laying next to my husband, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the wall, talking to someone on the phone, or just humming to himself as he sketched. That morning, my husband had a doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just routine, something he didn't even mention until he was already grabbing his keys. I remember watching him from the hallway as he checked his pockets, patting down his coat absently, eyes scanning the room without urgency. When he looked up at me, I smiled, and he smiled back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll be back around lunch," he said, already halfway out the door. I nodded. "Drive safe." And then he was gone. The silence that settled over the house was thick, not oppressive, but aware. I walked to the kitchen and started tidying up, wiping counters that didn't need cleaning, folding tea towels I'd already folded yesterday, running a cloth over a spotless sink. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. I found him in the garage. He was crouched beside the old bicycle, my husband's, trying to realign the chain. There was grease on his hands, a streak of it near his temple where he must have brushed his hair back. He didn't hear me at first. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, the muscles of his forearms flexing as he turned the pedal slowly, eyes narrowed in concentration. I should have left. Instead, I stepped inside. "You're brave to take that thing on," I said lightly. He looked up. His expression softened the second he saw me. "Figured I'd earn my keep somehow." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but thick with something unnamed. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. As he turned, the light from the single window behind me caught the outline of his jaw, the shape of his collarbone through the thin fabric of his t-shirt. "Want to hold the handlebars while I tighten the bolts?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I stepped closer, took hold of the rubber grips, my fingers brushing his for the briefest second. His hands were warm, rough from work, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. We worked in silence. Or maybe not silence exactly. The low hum of air through the window, the faint sound of a bird outside, the occasional clink of metal against metal. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine, the brush of his shoulder as he leaned in, the scent of soap and oil and something earthy. And then I lost my grip. The handle jerked as he turned a bolt too fast, and instinctively he reached out, one hand on mine, the other steadying the bar. For a split second, we were inches apart, breathing the same air. "Sorry," he murmured. I shook my head, but I didn't move. His eyes held mine, and for the first time, I didn't look away. His fingers were still wrapped around mine, and I could feel the tremor beneath his skin. Or maybe it was mine. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe neither of us did. Maybe gravity did the work for us. His mouth found mine gently. No rush, no force, just quiet pressure, warm breath, lips that tasted like mint and salt and hesitation. I felt his fingers slide to the back of my hand, tracing the edge of my wrist. My other hand rested flat against his chest, not to push him away. I didn't even think of that. But just to feel that he was real. It didn't last long. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe a lifetime. We broke apart like startled children, both of us stepping back at the same time, both trying to pretend it hadn't just happened. He spoke first. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted too fast. "It's fine. It's nothing. We're just tired. Lonely." He nodded, slowly, but neither of us moved. When I finally turned and walked out, I felt the burn of his gaze on my back. My legs were unsteady. My breath caught somewhere between guilt and something darker. Something I hadn't let myself feel in so long, I almost didn't recognize it. Desire. Back in the kitchen, I washed my hands as if I could rinse the moment from my skin, but the tingling stayed. In my palms, in my chest, in the quiet ache behind my knees. That night, I avoided his eyes at dinner. My husband chatted about lab results and cholesterol, oblivious to the electricity simmering 2 chairs away. The table felt too small, the lights too bright. Later, alone in the bedroom, I opened my drawer and pulled out the green lace set again. I laid it across the bed. My hands ran over the fabric slowly, tracing the shape of a woman I barely remembered. I didn't put it on. Not yet. But I didn't put it back either. The morning after, everything felt too quiet. There's a particular kind of silence that follows something you can't take back. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, muffled one, like the air just before a storm. I moved through the house as if the walls had ears. I avoided the guest room. I kept myself busy in the kitchen longer than usual, even when I had nothing left to prepare. The clink of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the scraping of chair legs. Everything sounded too loud, as if to remind me that yesterday really happened. He didn't come down for breakfast. That was unusual. Since he'd arrived, he had been the first at the table every morning, casually sipping coffee before my husband woke. We'd grown used to those few quiet minutes. Small talk about weather, newspaper headlines, sometimes a shared smirk over my husband's outdated jokes. But this morning, the space across from me remained empty, the chair untouched. I told myself it was for the best, that maybe he'd left early, that maybe he regretted it, that maybe I should too, but I didn't. That terrified me. By mid-morning, my husband had left for a client meeting. I heard the familiar sound of car doors, his voice trailing off into the driveway, and then silence again. Not the heavy kind this time, but expectant, charged, like a held breath. I found him in the backyard, seated on the old bench beneath the magnolia tree, sketchbook open on his lap. He didn't look up when I approached, but he knew I was there. His pencil slowed but didn't stop. I stood behind him, arms crossed, unsure of what I was doing, or why I hadn't just stayed inside and done what a sane woman would do. Pretend. But I didn't want to pretend. He turned the page. The sound of paper against paper made me flinch. Finally, he spoke. "I can go if it's too strange." I said nothing for a moment. The wind rustled through the branches, sending a few petals drifting to the grass below. "It's already strange," I said, and my voice surprised me with how steady it was. "But I don't want you to go." He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He just nodded, slowly, as if filing that sentence somewhere behind his ribs. Later that day, while dusting the bookshelf in the living room, I found an old photo album wedged between tax folders and outdated cookbooks. I pulled it out on instinct. Inside, there were photos from a family gathering we hosted years ago, his first Christmas after being adopted by my husband's son. In one picture, he was standing at the edge of the frame, barely 13, arms crossed, unsmiling. And in the background, there I was, pouring cider, mid-laugh, hair pulled up in a loose bun, younger than I remembered feeling in that moment. There was a strange symmetry in it. How we had once been parts of the same photo, same story, separated by time and space and roles assigned by other people. I closed the album gently and tucked it back where I found it. But the image stayed with me. That evening, my husband brought home a surprise. He called me into the living room with the excitement of someone who thinks they've done something grand. On the coffee table was a gift bag from a local boutique I liked. The kind of place I hadn't shopped at in years because the prices always felt indulgent. I opened it slowly. Inside was a pale pink cashmere cardigan. Soft, expensive, thoughtfully chosen, and completely wrong. He looked proud of himself. "You're always cold," he said. "Thought this might help." I smiled. I thanked him. I even kissed his cheek. But inside, I felt an odd deflation. He meant well. But it was another gesture of care without seeing me. I wasn't cold. I was burning. Every part of me that used to sleep was waking up, limb by limb, and no cardigan in the world could soothe that. Later that night, while cleaning up after dinner, I noticed the guest room door slightly ajar. Something about the angle of it, the way the hallway light spilled in, the shadow it cast, made me stop. I stood there a moment before knocking once, quietly, and pushing the door open. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, sketchbook in hand. He looked up. No smile, no greeting. "I just wanted to say thank you," I said, not sure why I chose those words. "For what?" His voice was soft, low. "For reminding me I'm not invisible." He closed the sketchbook, set it aside. "You're never invisible," he said, meeting my gaze. "You just stopped being seen." There was a silence after that, not heavy, not tense, but full. I didn't cross the threshold. I didn't move closer, but I didn't walk away either. The next morning, I dressed with more intention. Nothing loud, nothing provocative. Just a fitted sweater that hugged my waist and a pair of jeans that reminded me I still had hips. I applied a touch of blush and wore the perfume I'd forgotten I owned, the one that smelled like late dinners and champagne once upon a time. At breakfast, my husband commented on the weather. He asked if I needed anything from the store. I shook my head, sipping my coffee in silence. But when I looked across the table and met his eyes, not my husband's, his, I saw it again. That flicker of recognition, that hunger barely veiled behind restraint. And for the first time, I didn't look away. I never used to pay much attention to lingerie stores. They always felt like foreign territory, spaces designed for a younger version of myself, a version that still thought of silk and lace as something earned, not just nostalgic. But that afternoon, I found myself walking through one of those small boutiques tucked between a wine shop and a nail salon. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I told myself I was just browsing, that it was curiosity, a whim. But my fingers knew what they wanted. They moved over the hangers instinctively, grazing the fabrics, testing their weight. I stopped when I found it. Dark plum lace with satin straps. Elegant, subtle. Not the kind of thing meant to be seen, but to be felt. I held it against myself for a second, not in front of a mirror, just against my own chest, beneath my coat. My heart was beating faster than it should have. I bought it without trying it on. Back home, I slipped it on in the upstairs bathroom. I didn't lock the door. My husband wasn't home. The lace clung softly to my skin, wrapping around my ribs like a secret. I stood in front of the mirror, eyes trailing over collarbones, shoulders, the swell of hips. Not judging, just observing. As if reacquainting myself with a woman I hadn't spoken to in years. It wasn't about looking beautiful. It was about feeling present in my body again. Not out of vanity, but out of hunger, for touch, for sensation, for being reminded that I wasn't just some functional silhouette moving through a house. That night, I wore it beneath a simple dress, navy, sleeveless, cut just low enough at the back to make me feel it as I walked. I didn't say anything to my husband. We were having dinner at home, nothing formal. He wouldn't have noticed if I'd worn pajamas, but I did it anyway. He noticed. Not my husband. Him. He came to dinner a few minutes late, hair still damp from a shower. I was setting the table, candles already lit, low music playing in the background, one of those jazz playlists my husband liked to put on because it made the silence seem less obvious. I felt his eyes on me before he even entered the room. It was the shift in air, the pause, like something waiting to drop. He greeted us both politely, sat down, complimented the roast. I barely tasted anything on my own plate. We didn't speak directly, but the tension sat between us like a third-place setting. Later, after my husband went upstairs, claiming a headache or maybe just needing to rest, I found myself lingering in the kitchen. I wasn't doing anything, just moving spoons into drawers, rearranging placemats that didn't need straightening. He walked in, quiet, measured. I didn't turn around. He leaned against the door frame. I felt his presence before I heard his voice. "You looked different tonight." My hands stilled. Different how? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Like yourself. The version of you no one else gets to see." I turned to face him. He wasn't smiling. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were direct, unblinking. And in that second, the room shrank around us. Not physically, but emotionally. Everything else fell away. The kitchen, the hallway, the worn-out ticking of the old clock above the sink. I walked past him toward the stairs, my steps slower than necessary. I felt his eyes on me the entire way, and as I turned the corner, I didn't rush. I let him look, not as a tease, not as a game, but as an answer. That night in bed, my husband reached for me. His hand brushed my side beneath the blanket. Gentle, familiar, hesitant maybe. We hadn't been close in weeks. Months, really. It wasn't his fault. And yet the moment he touched me, I froze. Not because I didn't want intimacy, but because the warmth wasn't enough. The pressure was wrong, the rhythm unfamiliar. I let him continue. I let the moment play out, eyes open, staring into the ceiling. And all the while, I thought about the man in the guest room, about how he had looked at me without touching me, how that gaze had reached places fingertips never could. Afterward, my husband fell asleep quickly, breathing deep and even. I rose quietly, stepping into the bathroom and shutting the door behind me. The mirror was fogged from the shower earlier. I wiped a corner of it with my hand, stared into my own eyes. My skin was flushed, not from passion, but from shame. And underneath it, something more dangerous. The recognition that I had crossed a line inside myself. The betrayal wasn't in the kiss. It was in the desire to be kissed again. I changed into a nightgown, pulled my hair back, slipped beneath the covers, and lay still, listening to the faint creak of the floor above the guest room. I imagined him there, sketchbook on his lap, thoughts racing, hands folded behind his head, eyes wide open. He wasn't asleep. Neither was I. The trip wasn't something I planned, at least not at first. I'd mentioned once, offhand, half in passing, that I used to go to the coast alone when I needed to breathe. It was a small beach town 3 hours away, nothing glamorous. A string of local shops, an old wooden pier, a motel that always smelled faintly of salt and citrus cleaner. I hadn't been there in over a decade. I brought it up at dinner one evening, maybe as a test, maybe as a way to remind someone, anyone, that I still had places in my mind untouched by routine. My husband didn't hear me. Or he did, and simply nodded, the way he always did when I spoke about things that belonged to the version of me he'd stopped noticing years ago. 2 mornings later, I packed a weekend bag. I told him I needed some air, that I'd be back by Sunday evening. He offered to come. I smiled and said it was okay, that it was something I wanted to do alone. He accepted it too easily, and I should have felt relief. But instead, I felt that old bitterness rising in my throat. The one that whispered, "You are always alone, even when he's right beside you." I didn't tell anyone else I was going, not even him. The drive was uneventful, except for the way my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have, and how I checked the rearview mirror more often than necessary. The coastline appeared suddenly, like memory returning in fragments. I parked in the same lot where I used to sit with a paperback in the afternoons. The ocean hadn't changed. Neither had the breeze that curled through open car windows. The motel was still there, same chipped paint, same brass key on a plastic tag. Room 7. The room smelled like it always had. Sun-drenched linen, old wood, distant salt. I didn't unpack. I set my bag on the chair and opened the balcony door instead. The ocean was close enough to taste in the air. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind run fingers through my hair, wondering what it meant to crave something unnamed. I didn't expect to see him. That part I didn't plan. It was late afternoon when I walked into the small cafe by the boardwalk just to get tea. I stood in line, scanning the menu, fingers wrapped around the strap of my purse, when I felt it, that stillness in the air, the kind that happens when something shifts before the body catches up. I turned slowly. He was at the far table by the window, sketchpad open, pen poised. He didn't look surprised, just calm. He stood, walked toward me. No questions, no pretense. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "A few hours." "You followed me?" Number, I remembered what you said. We didn't speak again for several minutes. We just sat at that table, the ocean in the distance, the noise of the cafe, a dull blur behind the tension between us. There was no hiding now, no pretending we were just two people under the same roof out of circumstance. This, whatever this was, had turned a corner. Later, we walked along the beach, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel it could happen at any second. The water was colder than I remembered. The sky was layered with clouds, all shades of gray and lavender. My hair kept catching in the wind, and he reached over once to tuck a strand behind my ear. His fingers brushed my cheek, then lingered a second too long. We didn't speak about the kiss in the garage. We didn't need to. As we reached the end of the boardwalk, the wind louder now, the light fading, I stopped. He turned to face me. There was that look again, steady, knowing, quiet. I didn't wait for him to move. I leaned in. Our lips met in the middle of the wind and salt and late afternoon shadows. The kiss was different this time, less hesitant, still slow, still uncertain, but charged. Like the moment just before lightning splits a sky. His hands found my waist. Mine moved to his chest. There was nothing rushed, just the knowledge that we had already crossed a line long ago, and this was merely the confirmation. When we parted, my lips still warm, my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs. I didn't apologize. I didn't run. Back in the motel room, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I wasn't trying to assess my reflection. I wasn't looking for youth or answers. I was looking for the truth in my own eyes. For a long time, I hadn't recognized the woman staring back. But now, her skin flushed, her mouth slightly parted, her heart loud beneath her ribs. She was undeniable. That night, I didn't change into something modest. I didn't brush my hair into something neat. I slipped on the plum-colored lace and curled into the bed with the windows cracked open, the sound of the ocean folding into the room like breath. I slept, alone, but not untouched. In the morning, he was gone. No note, no message. Only a sketch tucked under my door. It was me. Not a romantic version, not idealized, not softened. Just me. Hair wild, mouth serious, eyes steady. The kind of image that comes from looking, really looking. It felt more intimate than any kiss. I held it in both hands for a long time before sliding it into my bag, not ready to fold it, not ready to let it become part of the past. And even as I packed to go home, as I locked the motel door and stepped out into the white light of late morning, I knew it wasn't over. It had barely begun. Returning home was quieter than leaving. There were no questions, no remarks, no surprises. My husband greeted me with a peck on the cheek and a soft, "Glad you're back." He took my overnight bag without hesitation, set it gently near the stairs, and asked if I wanted tea. Just like that, as if I'd run a mundane errand, as if the days hadn't folded in on themselves somewhere along the coast, as if I hadn't tasted someone else's mouth under a silver sky. I nodded. Tea sounded simple. Tea sounded harmless. The house hadn't changed. The kitchen still smelled like dried basil and floor polish. The folded laundry sat neatly in the corner chair. The orchids on the windowsill had begun to wilt slightly. No one had thought to water them. I moved through the room slowly, brushing fingers along counters, catching myself in door frames, wondering how long it would take for the weight of what happened to settle into the walls. He was gone. My husband told me over dinner, casually, without tension, that he'd left early that morning. Said he had work up north, someone to meet about a commission. I didn't react. I just nodded again, chewing slowly, tasting nothing. "Did you have a good time?" he asked, pouring more water into my glass. I looked at him. Really looked. The kind eyes, the lined forehead, the reliable movements of a man who never once, in all these years, tried to break my heart. The man who showed up every day, who paid bills on time, who replaced light bulbs before they flickered out. "It was what I needed," I said softly. He smiled at that, pleased with himself, as if giving me space had been the right move. That night, I lay in bed next to him, the room entirely dark except for the blinking light of the smoke detector overhead. I counted the seconds between each flicker. I kept expecting to feel something, guilt, regret, shame, but all I felt was distance, not just from my husband, but from the version of myself who had once settled for this quiet rhythm. The next morning, I opened the guest room door. His things were gone. The bed was made, corners tucked tightly. The room felt untouched, but I knew better. It still held the scent of his cologne, barely perceptible, but enough. I stood in the middle of the room for a while, arms crossed, unsure whether I was trying to hold myself together or just hold on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. Then I saw it, folded neatly on the desk, a piece of paper, unlined, torn from a sketchbook. It wasn't another drawing. It was a note. Only a few words, scrawled in pencil with just enough pressure to leave grooves in the paper. You don't need to explain anything. I just needed to know it wasn't only me. No signature, no name. But it didn't need one. I slipped the note into the same envelope that held the sketch he'd left under my motel door. 2 fragments of something I couldn't define. Something that hadn't ended but couldn't continue. Not here. Not yet. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, methodically, obsessively. I scrubbed the stovetop until it gleamed. I washed windows I hadn't touched in months. I took down curtains and laundered them just to watch them whip against the glass as I rehung them. My husband thought I was nesting, resetting, rebalancing myself after a weekend away. He didn't see the restlessness behind it, the way I moved to avoid stillness, the way my body ached for something that wasn't even physical. In the evening, I found myself in the garden. It was nearly dusk. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary and damp earth. I stood barefoot on the flagstone path, soil clinging to the arches of my feet. My dress swayed in the soft breeze. I held a mug of chamomile tea, untouched, both hands wrapped tightly around the ceramic for warmth I didn't need. I replayed everything. The kiss in the garage, the sketchbook, the way his voice dropped when he spoke only to me, the look in his eyes when he said I wasn't invisible, the beach, the motel, the ocean air between our mouths, the way he left, not selfishly, not dramatically, but with just enough distance to let me breathe. His lips traced the corner of my mouth before finding their place, warm and familiar. My fingers rested on the base of his neck, not pulling him closer. He was already close, but grounding myself in the shape of him. It was careful, unrushed, as if we both understood that rushing would somehow cheapen what we already knew to be dangerous. My heart pounded, not from guilt, not even from fear, but from the clarity that I wanted this. Not the fantasy, not the drama. This. When we pulled apart, there was no apology, no hesitation. We sat on the edge of the couch, bodies still close, not speaking. The clock ticked softly from across the room. A bird outside the window let out a thin, uncertain note. "I don't know where this leads," I whispered. He didn't respond with promises. He didn't offer hope or guarantees. He just reached over, brushed his thumb along my knuckles, and held my hand in silence. Later, he stood by the door. I followed him there. We didn't kiss again. We didn't touch, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air around us like perfume. He looked at me. Tell me to stop. If you need me to. Tell me now. I opened my mouth, closed it, then said, "Not yet." And just like that, he left. But something stayed. Not the man himself. Not his scent or his heat. What remained was more dangerous. His absence, heavy and pulsing like a second heartbeat in my chest. The day after he left, the house betrayed me. It was too clean, too orderly. The chairs were all at the correct angles beneath the table. The cushions on the couch stayed exactly where I had left them. The shadows moved predictably across the floor as the sun passed, and not one thing, not one, carried the scent or warmth of the hour he had spent here the day before. Except for me. I walked through the rooms trying to ignore the way my skin remembered his hands, the way my lips still felt warm. I tried to act like the version of myself who belonged to this life, the one who loaded the dishwasher with quiet precision, who wrote grocery lists in neat columns, who folded the laundry into sharp rectangles and didn't tremble when folding her husband's shirts. But that woman was thinning, like paint left too long in the sun. And the more I tried to wear her, the more I felt like a guest in my own home. When my husband returned that evening, his voice carried that same easy cadence. No shift, no pause, no edge to suggest he sensed something was different. He placed his travel bag near the door, kissed my cheek, and told me he'd missed the coffee here. We had dinner on the patio. He talked about the lake house, about someone's dog that wouldn't stop barking, about how badly he slept on unfamiliar mattresses. I nodded in all the right places, smiled once or twice, but the whole time, I felt my insides pulling in two directions. One toward him out of memory and loyalty, and one away into something unspoken but undeniably alive. He poured wine, opened a bottle of something we'd been saving, said it felt like a celebration, even if he couldn't name why. I watched the glass fill, watched the light catch the liquid like it was trying to reveal something. Then he reached across the table and touched my wrist. Not urgently, not hungrily, just a soft brush, his thumb moving in a circle over the inside of my arm, a gesture he hadn't made in years. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we need time. Together. Just us. Like we used to." I didn't move. I just looked at his hand on mine and tried to remember what it used to feel like when he touched me that way. "You're probably right," I said, because it was the easiest lie to speak aloud. That night, he kissed me differently. There was more attention in it, more curiosity than I expected, as though he'd been reminded I had a body that responded, that I wasn't just an extension of his routine. I let him. I let the moment stretch long enough for him to believe we were okay. But when his mouth moved lower and his hand slipped beneath my nightgown, something in me recoiled. It wasn't his fault. He was gentle, familiar, practiced. He knew where to touch and when, but it was mechanical, like muscle memory performing without soul. And I lay there, my hands fisted into the sheets, trying to conjure warmth where only numbness lived. Afterward, he drifted off quickly, his arms still draped over my waist, his breath slow and even. I lay there with my eyes wide open. I thought about the other body, the one I had let in, the one that had pressed against mine like a question instead of an answer, the one whose silence said more than words ever could. I thought about his gaze, not just the desire in it, but the recognition. He looked at me like he'd caught me unraveling and chose not to stop it. When I finally rose from bed, it was still dark. I went to the bathroom, closed the door, turned on only the small vanity light. I looked in the mirror and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Not guilt, not shame, resolve. And underneath it all, one unrelenting truth. I wanted more. Not necessarily of him, or of the stolen moments, or of motel rooms with ocean views. I wanted more of myself, more aliveness, more color, more friction and tension and pull. I wanted to feel wanted, not just acknowledged. Later, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, I found the cardigan again, the pale pink one my husband had given me days earlier. I held it in my hands, soft as it was, delicate in its construction. It was beautiful, thoughtful, completely devoid of any fire. I folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer, and chose instead a navy wrap I hadn't worn in years. It hugged my waist, dipped slightly at the back. It wasn't provocative, but it made me stand differently. At dinner, my husband mentioned taking a trip together. "Somewhere warm," he said, pouring wine. "Just the two of us. I think we could use it." I looked at him, and something in my chest softened, not with affection, but with sorrow. He was trying, he really was. But some things, once shifted, never returned to their original shape. I smiled, raised my glass, and said, "Let's talk about it." He thought it meant yes, but I knew it meant maybe. The first thing I noticed when I came down that morning was the quiet. Not just the ordinary kind, the one that filled our kitchen when the coffee hadn't finished brewing or when my husband was still upstairs checking his blood pressure. This quiet was intentional, layered, almost theatrical, like the breath held before a confession. It threaded itself through the rooms, settled over the wooden floors, hovered near the windows. Something about it made my skin prickle. My husband had left early. A business trip this time, a 2-day retreat hosted by one of his longtime colleagues at their lake house 3 hours away. He packed quickly the night before, in a sort of distracted routine that made me wonder whether he noticed my detachment, or simply chose not to. I helped him fold shirts and pair socks. I zipped his suitcase. I reminded him not to forget his reading glasses. We moved around each other like dancers who'd long since learned the steps, but no longer heard the music. He kissed my forehead, before leaving, told me he'd call from the road. I said I'd be fine. An hour later, I was still in my robe, sitting on the edge of the couch, untouched tea, cooling in my hands. I hadn't turned on the news. I hadn't made breakfast. I just sat there, watching the light creep across the hardwood floor in slow, confident lines. And then, a knock. It was soft, measured. I didn't move right away. My heart had already recognized the rhythm before my mind caught up. I set the mug down, stood slowly, crossed the hallway like someone approaching an altar. I opened the door. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was no reason to. The moment had already decided itself before either of us had the chance to rewrite it. He stepped inside. He looked different. A week had passed, and yet the change wasn't about time. It was about distance, about something burning just beneath the surface. His jaw was tenser, his eyes more certain, as if he'd spent the last several days building walls, only to find himself needing to tear them down. We stood in the living room, the space between us thick with things we hadn't said. My robe was still tied loosely at the waist. My hair was unbrushed, but I didn't turn away. "I wasn't going to come," he said finally. I nodded. I told myself it would just settle on its own. Another pause. The air between us pulsed. "And yet here you are," I murmured. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite relief, not quite fear, just presence. That rare, charged awareness of another person so close your breath begins to synchronize with theirs. I stepped back, wordless, and he followed me into the kitchen. We didn't touch. Not yet. But the current had returned, coiled tight between us, ready to strike at the smallest invitation. I moved to the stove, turned on the kettle, simply to fill the space with something tangible. He leaned against the counter, watching me, not hungrily, not possessively, just intentionally. It felt more intimate than anything we had done so far. As the kettle began to rumble, I turned toward him. "How long can you stay?" He shrugged slightly. "Until I can't." There was something in that answer that landed between us like a shared secret. I poured the water, set the cups down, but neither of us touched them. We stood in the center of the kitchen, steam rising in lazy curls beside us, eyes locked, the gravity undeniable. This time, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't sudden. This time, I moved first. I reached for his hand, slowly, and placed it on my waist. The gesture was simple, barely a movement, but it was everything. He stepped closer. Our bodies aligned without hesitation, and then the distance disappeared. The kiss came slowly, like returning to something forgotten. I couldn't go back. Even if nothing more ever happened, Even if that chapter ended exactly where it stood, the mirror had changed. I had changed. No cardigan or dinner date or quiet touch from a man I'd promised my life to could undo that. The next morning, I packed a small bag, not for a trip, not for a getaway, just enough to make it look like I had errands. I told him I needed space, a walk, a drive, time to think. He kissed my forehead again and told me he was proud of me for taking care of myself. He had no idea what I was taking care of. In the car, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the neighborhoods until the streets became unfamiliar. And when I reached the small hill that overlooked the southern part of the city, I parked, rolled down the window, and breathed. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls, nothing from him. And still, he was there. In my pulse, in the way I adjusted my seat, in the spot on my wrist where his lips had once rested like a secret. That afternoon, I returned home and found a small envelope on the doorstep. No name, just a sketch tucked inside. Not of me, not of him, of our house. But from a strange angle, framed through the magnolia tree, drawn as if observed from a distance. The lines were loose, unfinished, as if the artist had intended to complete it later, as if something had interrupted him just before the roof was done. I turned it over. On the back, one sentence in pencil: "You feel like home, even when you leave it." I pressed the paper to my chest and stood there in the foyer for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just existed in the weight of what had been said. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether this would end badly. Because part of me had already decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that I felt alive again. And that, for now, was enough. There's a moment just before you make a decision that changes your life, when everything becomes unbearably quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes. It's a different kind, dense and electric, as if the entire world is holding its breath with you, waiting to see what you'll do. That was the quiet in my chest the morning I stood in the bedroom, suitcase open on the bed, deciding which pieces of my life to fold and which ones to leave behind. I didn't tell my husband I was leaving, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because the weight of explanation felt like too much to carry. The words didn't line up right in my mouth. There was no vocabulary for this kind of goodbye, not yet a betrayal, not quite a confession, just a shift, a truth that couldn't be unlearned. He thought I was going to visit a friend. I let him believe it. I packed light, only what I could carry without looking suspicious. A few dresses, a worn copy of a novel I hadn't finished, the plum lace set that still felt like a secret I hadn't finished telling myself. The taxi pulled up before sunrise. I moved through the house slowly, pausing in the living room, brushing my fingers over the edge of the mantel. The photograph of us on our 10th anniversary still stood there, slightly askew in its frame. We looked happy. Maybe we were. But even in the photograph, my body leaned slightly away from his. A small, unconscious tilt that only made sense now. I didn't take the photo with me. In the hallway, I passed the guest room, now empty. He hadn't returned since the day he left the sketch of the house, but his absence filled the space louder than any presence. The room felt paused, as if it might resume at any second. Outside, the morning air bit at my throat. I clutched my coat tighter, slid into the back seat of the taxi, and gave the driver a destination that felt like neutral ground. The station. The city was still waking up. Storefronts unlit, streets glistening from an early rain, windows blinking into consciousness one by one. The train station loomed ahead, impersonal and gray, its platform stretching towards something uncertain. My pulse was loud in my ears, not from fear, but from the gravity of choice. I sat on the bench farthest from the schedule board, suitcase at my feet, his sketch folded neatly inside my coat pocket. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to. The lines were etched into me now, the roofline unfinished, the angles imperfect. It wasn't a house. It was a question. The minutes passed. People came and went. No one noticed me, and that anonymity felt both like freedom and punishment. I tried to imagine what he'd say if he saw me here. I tried to imagine if he was somewhere watching the same clouds roll across the sky, wondering if I'd show up. But he hadn't asked me to. That was the hardest part. He hadn't begged. He hadn't chased. He had simply left space, an invitation without pressure, an open door that required me to step through of my own volition. And I didn't know if I could. The train pulled in, not the one I meant to take, but it stopped, its doors sliding open with a hush that sounded suspiciously like opportunity. I stood, not out of commitment, but out of instinct. My hand found the suitcase handle. My feet moved forward, slow, unsure, and then I stopped. Not because I changed my mind, but because something inside me whispered that the decision wasn't about the destination. It was about the reason, about whether I was running towards something or away from everything else. I stepped back from the platform. I let the doors close. The train pulled away, and with it, the version of me who might have vanished into it. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe minutes. Maybe longer. Eventually, I turned and walked out of the station. Not back toward home, not toward him. Just forward. One block at a time, breathing, thinking, feeling everything that pulsed beneath my skin. I wasn't ready, but I wasn't afraid either. Somewhere between the man I'd built a life with and the man who had reminded me I was still a woman, there was something else waiting. Me. And for now, that was where I needed to begin.